Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of how Vellum works, advanced Vellum tricks. And today what I'm mainly going to be showing you is how to animate certain properties in Vellum during the simulation. So for example, the amount of pressure that we're getting in our kind of balloon object here, and things like that. I'll also show a handful of sort of bonus tricks. For example, how to use some of the properties that we're getting out of our Vellum sim to affect things like our shaders, which I will show off in Redshift, but could be applied to any render engine that you can use with Houdini. Let's check it out. So first of all, I've just made this really kind of simple scene here with this little 2-second character that I made. Using just to draw a curve and some volumes, and basically I have in here a group that is our thing, and I have a group that is our belt, which is going around our thing, and then I'm just merging them together and coloring them so that it's nice to visualize. And if I plug them into the Vellum setup that I've made, and we hit play, we get a really fun little character who is inflating and deflating with this sort of belt that's helping kind of constrain him and add some extra funness to the simulation, where they're kind of both affecting each other. The belt is pulling in on him, and you can see that he's also kind of pushing out on the belt, which is a really nice thing about Vellum, that all these different kind of things, from grains to hair to soft bodies to cloth, all kind of work on each other without you having to do any fancy integration between different solvers or anything like that. So awesome. First, once you get your kind of objects that you want to set up with this kind of thing, then we can start setting up the Vellum constraints just like we did last time. So for here, what I've done basically is I've set up constraints separately for our pink belt, which I've over here just labeled very clearly belt constraints, and I've made them pink, and then the blue guy constraints. If I have those groups set, what I can do is when I jump into the cloth constraint that I set up, which I'll do from scratch over here, Vellum configure cloth, which sets up that node with the cloth constraints. Plug that in here, and then I can tell it to work on the primitive group, which you can change to points if you're setting up your groups with points, to the belt. So I'll set that onto belt, and the belt will just have some cloth constraints. And then down here, I will add another Vellum, and there's a handy Vellum configure balloon option, which actually just sets up a cloth constraint and a pressure constraint, which are kind of the two ones that you need together to create a balloon-like simulation. So I'll plug all these guys in, and on here I'll just set the group to work on my thing. I'll set this one to also work on my thing. And then if we plug these into the sim, we should right off the bat get some kind of interaction. So I'll hit play, and there's not a lot happening. It is moving, but it's all just kind of in that rest position that we set up, and it's nothing really too interesting is happening here. And that's because, again, we've basically just set these up at the rest lengths that we were inputting, so there's no real forces affecting it. On the Vellum solver, if we drop a new Vellum solver, actually, you will get gravity, which we obviously also don't want, because then it's just going to start falling. We could add a ground plane or whatever. For this one, I wanted to just turn off gravity in here, and I want to figure out how to make this balloon simulation a little bit more interesting. So in the pressure constraints, we can look and see the kind of properties that we can play with. So there's the stiffness one that we played with a lot last time, and there's a few other ones. There's like this rest length scale, And in the cloth one, we actually have the stretch parameters, the rest length for that, and then we also have this bend parameters and the rest length for that. In my experience using Vellum, the stiffness and the rest length of the stretch and the bend are kind of the most important things to be paying attention to, and I can sort of walk you through how all of those work really quickly. So if we visualize just the cloth constraints that we have on our donut, which we can do by plugging a null into this first constraint that we've set up here out of the constraint geometry output, you'll see that what we have is kind of interesting. It's basically these lines that are connecting each of the different points that we have on our geometry. So you'll see where we have like these kind of intersecting bits is actually where we have our points on our triangles. So, you know, if you look at here, you can kind of see that this is like being constrained to this is being constrained to this. And so the different attributes that we have on here, the stiffness, the stretch stiffness, is saying, okay, we want to keep the length of this stiff by this amount. And this amount is actually really large because in Houdini 18, they've added these sort of multiplier things out here. We could just set this to 1 and set this to a really high number. And what it's going to do is it's going to try to keep this really stiff. If we set this to a low number, then it's going to basically allow these to stretch out a lot. But if we keep them stiff, they're going to be stiff. And then the rest length scale down here is saying, okay, this constraint right here, the length of this constraint, this is our rest length. But we can multiply that by 2 or 0.5 or whatever amount, and it will say, okay, so we're starting the sim with it at this length, but what it really wants to get to is like half of this length. So it'll really kind of compress when we start the sim. So if we want to run that, and I'll just bypass these so we can see what that looks like. It is going to basically immediately kind of compress like that. And we don't have any constraints on our guy yet, so that's why it's blowing up like that. But you'll see we can do that, or in reverse, we can set this to 2 and have it so it blows up a ton and wants to become really kind of expanded. So that's how stiffness and stretch works. If we set the stiffness to be a lot higher, then it will immediately sort of pop to that sort of shape that we're talking about. Whereas if it's like really low, like 0.1, it kind of is just saying, just get there when you feel like it. It's not that important. And it will kind of slowly expand out to that. So cool, that's that. The bend stiffness is worth noting as well. So if we want to break this down to something really simple, let's say we have this polygon that we want to add cloth constraints to, and this is, you know, these are our points, and these are our constraints. The rest length of these constraints are going to be by default whatever they're sort of set up at the beginning as. So the sides are all 1, and the middle ones are the square root of 2. And our stiffness is saying, you know, if we move this out, well, do whatever you can to sort of compensate that and bring these back to 1, 1, and, you know, square root of 2 really fast if the stiffness is really high, or kind of slowly if the stiffness is like, you know, 1 or 10 or 0.1. And so, you know, that's all cool. If we set the rest length to something like, you know, be the rest length scale to like 2, then it's going to say, oh, well, we want to, you know, push this out so that these are all on the sides are double this, and this is also double. These will all kind of push out to help compensate for that, as we sort of saw in the last demo. And then with the bend constraints, it's just saying keep the orientation so that you won't let them sort of like bend down like this. If it starts to bend down because of the forces pushing on it, push it back up. And at the end of the day, all that vellum really is these sort of particles, which are the points on the side, that react to particle forces and stuff. And then these constraints that are saying, well, keep them in these places depending on, what we're setting up constraints-wise. So if we look at this example for the bend that I've set up here, and we just hit play on here, with the bend stiffness set to 0, that's kind of how cloth behaves normally out of the box. So if we play that, it's going to sort of droop down, and these are going to be allowed to sort of bend and act very clothy. But if we turn up the bend stiffness to like 10,000 or whatever, then this is going to play, and we're going to see the orientation is kind of being maintained of the constraints, where it's not being allowed to bend so much. It's more like a sheet of paper or something as opposed to cloth. So with these couple different things, the rest length and the stretch stiffness, and the bend stiffness, and the rest angle scale also is worth noting, which is basically the bend's equivalent of the rest length scale. We can make a lot of cool stuff with the sort of out-of-the-box vellum constraints. We have our vellum cloth, and again, since this stuff is just particles, it should make sense that when these collide, these are getting pushed, but there's no constraints to push them back to where they need to be. If we turn the cloth constraints on for this guy, then they're going to maintain that stiffness, and a little bit of that bend that you get by default, 0.1 bend that you get from default with the cloth constraints. So if we wanted to make this guy inflate, you can maybe guess that what we're going to want to change is going to be the rest length, but it's not the rest length of the cloth constraints. It's going to be the rest length of these weird pressure constraints that give us kind of a balloon-like feature. So the cloth constraints are actually going to stay the same rest length, but the pressure is going to basically push them out, and sort of like the same way you would see with like a balloon, it's going to kind of create this stress on the balloon material itself, while we have the balloon that's sort of trying to shrink back to its original shape, but it's very elastic and it doesn't have a lot of stretch stiffness, so it kind of lets it sort of inflate a lot due to the pressure. So if I go into the pressure constraints, and on this cloth one, I'm going to set the rest length scale to 0.5, so that instead it kind of constrains on our guy, like pulls in a little bit. Yeah. So if we set the pressure constraints rest length scale to 2 from 1, this is going to blow up when we start playing this like that, and it's going to get this kind of balloon-like behavior, combining the cloth and the pressure constraints together. So that's really handy, and if this is what you want to make, then great, you're done. But if you want to have a little bit more control and be able to have it so that maybe the rest length is animating up and down to make him inflate and then deflate and then inflate again, like I was doing in the demo in the beginning, then we're going to need to dive into DOPS. So let's go ahead and do that. The quick, easy way of doing that is by just double-clicking on this SOP level vellum solver. So if we double-click on here, then now technically we are in DOPS. And you might, be wondering, if you're used to DOPS and you haven't used vellum before, you might be wondering, why is it set up like this? This doesn't look like DOPS. If you look up here, you'll see we're actually in the vellum solver, in the DOPNet in the vellum solver. And if we jump in, click on this one, you can see, oh, we actually do have all that stuff. And where it's directing us when we jump into the vellum solver itself is into this forces subnetwork. So we can just add forces in here, which is nice and clean and keeps things simple and exposes the rest of the controls out here, like the gravity and all that stuff. Or if you want to get kind of a little bit more advanced with it, what I like to do, rather than setting this up all from scratch with DOPS, is I will often just right-click on the Vellum solver and say allow editing of contents and jump in. And then we get this whole mess. Don't worry about any of this except for over here we have our DOPNet, jump in. And then to be able to quickly get here easily, I like to set a quick mark. So I will press Control 2, and then out here I'll press Control 1, and then if I just press 1 and 2, I can kind of switch between my different contexts really easily. And I'm going to get rid of a lot of the stuff that we don't need. So I'll kill this gravity that we're not using, and I will get rid of this pop wind that we're also not using. And so if we play this, we got our sim going, and that's super cool. And you know, we can dive in here and add our stuff in here to keep it nice and clean, but I'm going to delete this and just add our forces directly into here, where it's plugging into the particle forces input of the Vellum solver. Now again, you can go and set this stuff from scratch. There's a pretty good Entagma getting started with Vellum tutorial that you can check out that's free on their site. But for me, 99% of the time, I'm usually good enough with the SOP Vellum solver, and often I will break in just to change a couple custom little things. One thing that I like to change really quick is outside of the DOPNet itself right here on the cache tab, you can turn on allow caching to disk, and that way if you run out of RAM that you're allowing it to cache with, it will just, rather than deleting the cache that's saved in the RAM at the beginning as you keep simming, it will just save that to disk instead. So it's slower to read, but it doesn't get rid of all that information in case you want to go back and get it. And all of these are just promoted to the controls outside of the Vellum solver. If you want to delete them and control this stuff on your own in here, you can do that, but we'll just do that as needed. So, you know, first we can start by plugging in stuff like, you know, pop force. And as I was saying, Vellum, again, it's just particles, like particles with constraints connecting the particles. So any pop solver will work in Vellum. So if we add a pop force and we, you know, add some amplitude to get some animated curl noise going, we can even visualize that by turning on the guide and seeing this is what this kind of noise is going to look like. Maybe we'll turn down the roughness. Then we get some extra fun kind of forces that are pushing these guys around. And just making them a little bit more wiggly, as if there's like a kind of turbulence in the air. So cool. I'm gonna get rid of that guy. We don't really want that for now. Maybe we want to add a pop drag, just a little bit. I'll give it a 0.1 air resistance, and so now we want to figure out how do we animate our constraints in Vellum, because that's really what we want to be doing, is animating those parameters that we got on our constraints. And this is a little bit of a tricky thing to figure out, but what I learned when I was figuring this out, we drop a null again and look at that constraint geometry output, and I'll turn off this visualizer that I made earlier. Again, all of those constraints are prims. There's points on the two sides of the prims, but all of them are ultimately prims. And the reason that there's less points than prims is because a lot of these prims are sharing the same points because they're all connected at the same point. So, you know, one point has a bunch of constraints coming off of it, and each of these lines is a prim. So that's worth noting. And then we have all these attributes that we can play with. So there's stiffness, which we know what that is. That's this. There's rest length, and we know what that is. That's this, or it's actually the original rest length that's feeding in times the rest length scale. I'm going to set this back to 1, actually, so that it's just feeding at the original rest length, and then we can animate that in DOPS. And then there's also rest length orig, which is going to be the original rest length. So if we're changing the rest length during the sim, that will be this, but this will always stay as that original rest length that we fed in, which you'll see kind of why that's useful in a little bit. So let's say you want to just animate the rest length of the pressure constraints. So we have the rest length scale set to 1 over here. But what you'll notice is that because we just have this rest length parameter and not pressure rest length or cloth rest length, or belt cloth rest length, or, you know, thing/guy cloth rest length, it's going to actually, if we tweak the rest length, change the rest length of all of these constraints. So if we just want to tweak the pressure constraints, what we have to do is turn on this output group so that the stretch pressure constraints get a group on them, and we'll call them pressure group. And then now we can use this to specify to only change the rest length of the pressure constraints. So if we jump back in here, I'm going to show you guys 2 different ways to go about animating these. One of them is using a wrangle, and the other one is using the velum constraint property, which is sort of meant to be an easier way to animate this stuff. I like using the wrangle, but this is here as well if you are less comfortable with Vex maybe. So first thing we want to do is plug this into our merge, which is going into our particle forces. And then what we're going to do is turn on this group so that it only acts on a certain group. And I'll turn on that pressure group. And then in here, we're going to turn on the rest length scale. So if we hit play, nothing happening here yet. If we turn the rest length scale up to 2, then it's going to inflate a bunch. And now, because we're in DOPS, we should actually be able to animate this stuff. So I'll start it off at like 0.25 maybe, so it's really scrunched up. Or actually, let's do 0.5. And then I'm going to turn the disable simulations thing down here, so I can just easily set keyframes without having to load the whole sim. And up here, I'm going to set this to like 5. So slowly it inflates more and more over time. And we'll hit play. So now if we play this, we just animated him inflating a bunch over time. And so that's pretty awesome. That may be all that you want. Maybe you just want to animate that. Similarly, if we wanted to do something like in our last tutorial where I had a setup with a walking guy, and we wanted to make it so that he slowly kind of collapsed over time by animating something like these pin constraints stiffness to go down to 0, I could do the same exact thing that I did with the balloon, where I set an output group, and I'll name it something like pins group. Then I'll dive into DOPS. I'll make a velum constraint property, plug it in there. I will grab the pins group, and then I will animate the stiffness. Now, important note, this is going to override whatever I had before. So if we set this to 1 by 1, the stiffness is not going to be nearly as strong. But that's okay, just something to kind of keep in mind. So let's set it not super strong. Maybe we'll set it to like 10. And he's just kind of wiggly. And then we can just kind of slowly animate him collapsing over time. So I'll set this down to 0 and hit play. Very fun. Now we have this guy who just kind of dies over time. So back to our weird floppy guy. Let's go back into here, and we have that animating thing. If we want to do basically what I did before, instead of just keying these parameters, we could put a little expression in. So we could use something like a sine wave. Sine, and note that this uses degrees. So if we go 0 to 360, that's going from 0 to 1 to square root of 2 to -1 back to 0. And if we say so sine at frame times 360, so it goes all the way around every frame. And then we maybe say 360 divided by the number of frames that we want it to sort of loop over. So we'll say we want it to loop every second. So we'll do $FPS, because that's an H script shortcut for our frame rate. And we will close that off. Then we have it going again from 0 to 1 to -1 back to 0. Now obviously we don't want it to scale the rest length negative, so we can fit this whole thing using a fit, and there's a shortcut for fitting something that fits from -1 to 1, which is fit 1 1 and then your thing, and then it knows to fit that between whatever values you want. So we can say 0.5 and maybe like 2. So it goes half and then double, and kind of rotates between those over the course of every second. And I think that should work. So there we go. Now we have a nice little breathing creature that we've made, and that's pretty fun. Now, hopefully that makes sense as far as how to animate these Vellum constraints in Vellum. There's another way that I want to explain how to do this, which is using wrangles. So I'm going to get rid of this Vellum constraint property, and I'm going to make a not a pop wrangle, because we're actually doing this on the constraints, which we've established before are primitives. So we need something that's like a prim wrangle, but there's no prim wrangle in DOPS. What we do have instead is a geometry wrangle, and I'll throw that on there, set it to run over primitives, and then plug that in here. So now what I should do is set my group to run over the pressure group that I've created again. So I'll type in pressure group and make sure it's spelled the same. And then, so you would think from there we can now go ahead and say at rest length, just for a good measure, we'll put an F there, and then equals F at rest length times 2. And then we hit play, and we're going to expect this to explode like a balloon, and nothing's happening to it. Now, why is that? So the important thing to realize here is that the geometry wrangle by default will operate over your geometry. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we type in our Vellum constraint property again, and we go to its bindings, you'll see it's actually not bound to the geometry, it's bound to the constraint geometry. So we don't want the stuff where we're tweaking our constraints to affect the geometry, we want it to affect the constraint geometry, as in this sort of second input that we're feeding it. So in the Vellum sim, what you're seeing is the geometry itself, and then the constraints, which we're not seeing, are the constraint geometry. So we have to call this constraint geometry, and now we should see something. Whoa, and that is blowing up really fast. what is going on there? Why is it not just going to double the rest length? Now, maybe you already know, but the reason for this is what we're doing is, unlike in SOPs, anything that is happening in DOPs, basically the thing that makes DOPs is that it's basically iterating every single frame. So what we're doing is we're saying rest length is rest length times 2, and then that gets multiplied, and then the next frame we have double the rest length, and then it's doubling that rest length, and that gets multiplied. So we're getting this insane amount of just like, it's just blowing up a crazy amount. So if what we actually wanted was it to just kind of slowly grow over time, we could multiply it by a much lower number, like rest length times equals, or rest length equals rest length times 0.01, which is the same also, as you should know if you're familiar with Vex, as saying rest length times equals 0.01. And that's cool, but it would be better if we had like a constant for our rest length to just refer to, so that we just had more kind of control. And that's why it's really useful to have something like the rest length orig parameter that we had. So if we say instead rest length equals f at orig, rest length orig, and then we multiply that by 2, then we should just get what we were expecting the first time around, which is double rest length, and then that's it, because it's just is setting this to equal that constant, and the rest length orig does not change in our sim. So hopefully that makes sense. Now that's all handy, but this is basically the same idea as what we had before. We could set up a rest length scale channel and add it onto here and animate this however we want. So we could say set it to 1, and then set some keyframes, set this to 5, and then set this to 0.5. So it's gonna kind of jump around a bunch, and we'll hit play. Boom, goes really big, then comes down really quickly, 2.5, and that's pretty cool. We could type the exact same expression that we had before into here, or we could do other things like, say, just set this to equal sine. And note that because we're using Vex this time around, as opposed to using HScript, which is what you use when you type in the little channels, it's the sine function in Vex is actually in radians instead of in degrees. So this is just an important thing to note. This means that we can use much smaller numbers, or we can use the radians function in Vex if we wanted to just convert. We could do sine of radians and then put in at frame times 360 divided by 24. So it should once again rotate all the way around from 0 to 1 to -1 back to 0 over the course of a second. And then we also need to do the fit 11 thing that we did before and set it to go 0.5 to 2, and then we should be good. And we can even set up channels for these if we wanted to have it so that it's slowly over time, you know, this became a larger number and this became a smaller number or whatever. So we hit play now. So you get the same kind of fun movement that we were getting before. And this is using a wrangle, so obviously we can do whatever we want with this wrangle. There's a lot of fun that could be had here with constraint settings and like doing the painting the stiffness attribute. Also a handy trick that I like to use a lot is if I'm doing something like painting stiffness, I just throw a prim wrangle here, and just so that I get that same rest length orig constant, I'll just say f at stiffness or orig equals, and since this is, you know, before the sim, this is going to become a constant, the stiffness orig. Well, the stiffness during the sim will change itself, so I can do stuff with the stiffness as well. But definitely a ton of possibilities with the stuff in here. So awesome. And the last thing that we'll be covering is how to get this sort of shading that's being driven by Vellum itself, which I mentioned at the beginning. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can see that if we drop a null after the sim, so we play this guy a little bit, and we drop a null connected to the constraint geometry output right here, and middle click, you'll see there are some cool attributes that we get out of the sim. So the main one being this stress attribute, which is a float attribute, which I think is pretty useful. So this is obviously a prim attribute, and it's just on the constraint itself. So what we need to do is transfer it onto the geometry and then use it to drive our shader. So what we can do is do an attribute transfer, and I'm going to transfer the stress attribute, transfer from here, transfer onto here. And then now if we middle click on here, we have the stress attribute on just the regular geometry that we're outputting. So that's cool. We definitely want to be able to visualize this somehow though. So if I throw down a visualize node on here, and by default it's set to position, so it's setting the color based on the position of all of our points. Set this to stress. Then we see on all of our prims now we have this really ugly stress attribute, which I'm not really a big fan of at the moment. One thing that we can do is promote the attribute from being a prim attribute to being a point attribute. So prim to point, and we'll call it stress. And now it's a little bit smoother looking, but it's still definitely not ideal. Because you can see that it's like, you know, there's these random kind of black spots in here where it looks like it should be pretty stressed out. So I'm gonna add a attribute blur to just kind of help smooth everything out a little bit. And that's already looking quite a bit better, I think. I also don't like how down here, where the values are pretty low, it's looking like there's still a decent amount of stress on there. So there's a couple ways we could deal with this, but what I would say we should do is throw a point wrangle, and we can sort of modify the stress attribute by saying f at stress equals channel ramp remap stress is what we'll call that channel, and it's going to remap the stress channel back onto itself. And I'll hit this thing, and now what we can do is kind of tweak this and add some more contrast. And let's also fit the stress attribute to 0 and 1. So now what we're kind of doing is saying anywhere the stress attribute is below 1, the value is really low. And anywhere it's above 1, the value is high. Let's actually maybe set this to be a regular fit and do 0 to 2, 0 to 1. Maybe we'll do 5. Maybe we'll do 3. And that's looking okay to me. I'm kind of digging that. I think we could add a lot more blurring iterations. But I think you should kind of get the idea for how that's working. Basically, this is saying that if the stress itself is below 3, then just set it to 0. And then if it's above 3, set it to 1. So we'll get this sort of stress attribute, which is again a float attribute, that's basically just being remapped here so that it doesn't look like this. And that way we can use it to drive a material blend between two shaders in Redshift, which I'm guessing most people are probably using, but if you're using Octane, this can definitely be done in Octane as well. If you're using Arnold, I'm pretty sure that you can do this in Arnold. If you're using Mantra, you can definitely do this. Any render engine where you have access to point attributes, you can do this. So let's create a null here, and we can call this render out, and then we are done in our dops and sops and can do everything with our materials and lights and rendering from now on. All right, so I've gone ahead here and set up just a basic kind of lighting setup with Redshift. I have an HDRI that I grabbed from HDRI Haven, which is a great free resource for HDRIs if anyone doesn't know. And then just 2 lights, just a top light and a little kick from the side. And set up my camera. One thing that I also did that I like to do is I set the camera to focus on this focus object right here, which is a null. And what you'll see is that this null is actually stuck pretty closely to this guy's face. It actually lags behind a little bit in kind of a smoother motion. And what the camera is doing is the focus distance is changing based on where the null is. And it's also looking at the null. It's using a look at constraint to follow the null. And the way that you can set this up is we create a new camera. And I'm gonna lock myself onto the camera too. And I want to create a look at constraint to look at this null. And it can be any null or any object. So this is my focus null. I'm going to click on the camera and then click on this enable constraints. And then in here, we have a bunch of useful options, including parent blend, follow path, all this nice stuff. So what I want to use is this look at constraint. So if I click that, it prompts me down here. Now look at, it prompts me down here. Now select look at object, if any, press enter to accept selection. So I'll click on the null because I want that to be the look at object, and I'll press enter. And it says now select look up object, if any. I'm not exactly sure what this is, but I'll just press enter. And now, there we go. I'm looking at this guy. And what's cool about this also is now, even if I move the camera around, it doesn't really matter where I move it. It's still going to be looking at this point no matter what. So it's constrained to be looking at that. And you might be wondering now, how did I get this null to stick onto this guy's face? And the way that I did that is I used a rivet. And rivets are really useful. These exist in other 3D programs as well. I believe this is like a sort of standard tool. I know that they have one in Maya. But basically, a rivet says it takes like 2 points on a piece of geometry, and it uses that to kind of compute like a transformation matrix and give a null object basically the transforms and rotations of that point on a surface. So I'll click into this guy and show you. I'll turn off this solver. And what I am doing here is I selected these points to be sort of where I want to stick the rivet. I made it a group called face, and then I made a rivet out null. And I'm rendering this one, but I set this up to do all this stuff here. And now that I've turned the solver off, actually, what you'll see is that this sticks directly onto the face, pretty much. And it can get a little bit jittery because the movement is like a little bit chaotic that's going on here. And if we like switched back to camera 1 here, you'll see like some of the movement is like really shaky, and that doesn't really feel like movement that you would see like an actual cameraman, you know, like it doesn't feel like super physically accurate because, you know, a true camera wouldn't be able to follow that point so precisely. It would kind of lag behind. So my solution to smoothing it out and making it feel a little bit more realistic is to add this solver. And all I'm doing in this solver here is really simple. This is kind of a clever trick I figured out, where all you do is you say every frame, because this is basically DOPS now. Every frame, what you're going to do, and you're going to iterate on this every frame, take the previous frame and take that input 1 that we're feeding it, you know, this, and blend shape between the previous frame and the current frame. And blend shape it with a bias towards the previous frame. So it kind of slowly will follow behind this guy. So now if I play this, you'll see this is a much sort of smoother version of that sim that we were just doing. Like this does not quite match up with this. It's like a less intense version basically. So anyway, this blend shape trick, you can use a lerp function in Vex instead if you want. I've done that as well a bunch, but a blend shape works and is quick and easy. This is a really useful thing in general for smoothing out animations, but I like it especially in combination with this sort of rivet option. So we go rivet out, and then we have this smooth. You can call the solver smooth if we want, but I'll just leave it. And then on this rivet, all you're doing is you're selecting the rivet geometry, so that rivet out null that I set, and you're selecting the point group that you want to rivet your thing onto, and then it creates this little rivet. And then just for good measure, I just attached a null to it, and then by attaching this null to it, it automatically is like parented to it. And then that's basically how I set that up. So cool, just a couple little camera tricks. The next stuff that we should go over is the shaders that I set up. So if we go into the materials, I have some boring stuff that I've set up for the belt, basically. We render this guy. It's nothing too fancy. It's basically just like a metallic-y sort of pinkish shader. The more interesting one is on our guy. What I've done is I've used this particle attribute lookup, which is the color, to attach the face on him. So you can grab any color or float or vector attribute from SOPs and read it into your shaders in Redshift or pretty much any render engine. So if you type in here, and I'll delete this guy we can type in particle, no, point attribute, redshift point attribute, and then it's here, it's called particle attribute lookup. Call this color, and we just change it from UV tangents to CD. So if I hit render now, this looks like this. And that's cool. I grab this CD right here, take it from the out color of the RS point attribute VOP, and plug it into the diffuse color of our plasticky material here. And that's not working. Yeah, there we go. Now it works. Just had to reload. And so that's cool. And then what I have basically going on is two materials that I'm blending between. So I have our plastic material, which I'll just feed in directly so you can see that. This is our plastic guy. And I also have our see-through material, which I will feed in directly, and you'll see it's our kind of like see-through guy with a little bit of subsurface scattering and stuff in there. And what I want to do is make it so that when it's stressed out, when it's like, you know, pushed open like a balloon, it kind of becomes more see-through, kind of suggesting that it's like, you know, pulling apart the material itself, and it's becoming like a little bit thinner because it's getting stretched out. So if we set this into a material blender, I'll set the plastic base color as our base material, and then I will set our layer color 1 as our see-through material. And then what I'm going to use to drive the changing shader, the blend color, is going to be our stress attribute that we're reading in, that we, you know, adjusted in the previous section. So the stress attribute, if I take this redshift point attribute, and I'll just make a new one again, redshift point attribute, and call it stress. That is, remember, a float attribute. So rather than pulling out the color, we want to pull out the scalar. Scalar and float are, I believe, almost completely synonymous. And we'll plug that into the blend color 1 here. And so what we should see from that, and I'll go to out, and I will tell it on the IPR to live SOP update. Now what we should see is, depending on the stress that we have on our guy, which we can also see again if we go to this visualize SOP here, depending on the stress, we should see different amounts of see-throughness. So like here, he becomes see-through, and then plastic, and then see-through again, and it ends up being a pretty cool effect. So hopefully that all makes sense, and I hope that this was a useful tutorial for anyone who watched it. I definitely plan to do some more of these in the future, so if anyone has any particular topics that they would like to be covered, I'm considering going over certain stuff like hair grooming, whatever people would be interested in learning. Drop me a line, and don't forget to check out www.houdininerd.com, where I have my Houdini learning resources doc, and I also have a link to join my Discord group on here, so you can hop in there, you know, free of charge, and we're all hanging out in there, chatting, talking about how to do all kinds of different fun Houdini things, and answering questions and helping each other out. So yeah, feel free to hop in there and hit me up if you have any thoughts or questions about how to do any of this stuff, or things that you would like to see in the future. Thanks so much, and take it easy.